Adab. Welcome to Habib Talks. In this episode, we'll be discussing art and the space of existence in Islam. It's a conversation with Professor Kishwar Rizvi from Yale University. I'm very grateful to you for taking out the time to talk to us. Professor Kishwar Rizvi is Robert Lehman Professor in the History of Art, Islamic Art and Architecture at Yale University. Her recent publications include The Transnational Mosque, Architecture and Historical Memory in the Contemporary Middle East, for which she was selected as a Carnegie Foundation Scholar, and Affect, Emotion and Subjectivity in Early Modern Muslim Empires, New Studies in Ottoman, Safavid and Mughal Art and Culture. Earlier publications include the Safavid Dynastic Shrine, History, Religion and Architecture in Early Modern Iran, as well as the anthology Modernism in the Middle East, Architecture and Politics in the 20th Century, which was awarded a Graham Foundation Publications grant. Welcome to Habib University, Professor Kishwar Rizvi, and thank you so much once again for being with us. I'd like to start by discussing your most recent anthology. In Affect, Emotion and Subjectivity in Early Modern Muslim Empires, you say at one point, identities in the early modern period were fluid and expansive. Could you elaborate on some of the contours of these identities in the early modern period?
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Naqvi, for inviting me and this opportunity to talk to everyone about my work. It's really a pleasure. So in this case, it's interesting that you picked up on something that is really quite crucial, I think, for this moment of early modernity, but which in the one hand feels very familiar to us, but on the other hand, quite far and, unfamiliar, in that identities, when I'm speaking about them, I'll give you the case of, say, the Mughal Empire, that we are familiar with and regionally, that there are, identities at that moment. You could be an artist, you could be an architect, you could be a calligrapher, you could be a weaver. You could have these multiple professional identities, and you were very much part of it, in the sense that you should think about these as specializations. Somebody is a khattat, for example, or a mimar and what have you. But what's interesting is you could also be both. You could be multiple. So think about the calligraphy on a building, any mosque that we go to, Badshahi Masjid, Sochne of Lahore, in Lahore. The person who designed the Quranic verses could have also been the one who designed or wrote the epigraphy on the Akbarnama, for example. Could also have been somebody who designed a Quran. So for example, if you were a calligrapher, you could be thinking in different media. So that's one thing, that one is, today when we think of professionalization, we think of being very specific, very specialized. Whereas what I would say in the early modern period, you could have your hand in a lot of art. For example, you could be writing poetry. Most princes of the Mughal court and princesses were trained in calligraphy. They painted, they wrote poetry, they patronized, the building of great mosques and other things. So you were what we would call today the sort of a Renaissance mindset, that you could be thinking on these multiple levels. You weren't restricted by any one thing. That's one aspect that I was thinking of, that intermediality, that one can think about professional sort of breadth and expansiveness. The other thing that I think is interesting to consider, and again, I think specific to this region, but you could also extrapolate to the Ottomans, you could think about Istanbul and all of these places, that what defined one wasn't necessarily your religious identity alone. I think at the moment, and especially in post-partition South Asia, we think of ourselves as, Hindus or Muslims or Christians or what have you. Whereas at that moment, some of the best artists of the Mughal atelier who were writing the histories of Islam, for example, were Hindu artists. Bishan Das, these were Khanezads. They were brought up in the Mughal court. Their families had been brought up there. They were part of the household, and there wasn't this sense that one is an outsider based on one's religious identity. And people rose through the ranks of society, regardless, in some sense. And I think that's something very important to be reminded of, that first of all, that here, thinking about Lahore, for example, again, since we're on the Mughal mode, was an extremely complex society, multi-religious, multilingual. You know, people spoke Rekhta, they spoke Hindi, they spoke, Hindi to nahi thi us zamane mein, but you know, they spoke Braj, they spoke Punjabi, they spoke Farsi, they spoke Arabic, they spoke Turkish, right? So people were operating on multiple levels of identities, whether they were linguistic, religious, professional, and so on. So that's something that I wanted to really bring up, is that complexity that in some sense the nation state has made us lose. You know,
Yes.
and I know that you have spoken about this as well in your work and in your teaching.
Yes. It's also reminding me of Manakia's recent book,
Yes.
Passionate Selves,
Exactly.
in which she makes the last point that you just made,
Yeah.
that people did not have national identities.
That's right.
Yeah?
That's right.
The next question I have for you is about your last monograph, the Transnational Mosque, Architecture and Historical Memory in the Contemporary Middle East. In this, you show how mosques and their architecture, as Jamal Ilyas put it, function symbolically and spatially as mediums for the communication of religious and political ideologies. Could you share some of your findings with respect to the nature and shape of contemporary ideologies as manifested in the architecture of the transnational mosque?
Sure. So interestingly enough, you know, you picked up on the 2 points that I think are really crucial in both of Mahdi's works. If the early modern period was, you know, thinking about the expansiveness of identities in a non-nationalist mode, you know, that you were thinking you were part of empires, you know, or you were part of cities, or you were part of other communities. You know, the nation state has created particular ways for us to function ideologically. The nation state in itself is an ideology, as you know. So what I wanted to do in the transnational mosque was to really put together a couple of different ideas. One, thinking about the geopolitics of what we sort of think of as the Islamic world, you know, West Asia, South Asia, and all the way out, thinking about Europe, thinking about even the Americas and so on. What role does religion have in those, you know, in the context of a sort of nationalist mode? Because I argue that although we think about, you know, the 20th, late 20th and the early 21st century as, you know, the age of globalization, that was a word that became very popular in the second half of the 20th century. And what I wanted to do was to really push against that and say that as much as we talk about it, you know, thinking through, you know, the movement of finance or the web or so on and so forth, that the nation is still very much what defines us. So what we are thinking of when we are talking, alas, absolutely. And in borders are actually much harder now than they ever were, as we know, because of the refugee crises and so on. That within that context, one thing that is moving, interestingly enough, fluidly, and in some sense similar to financial capital and or consumerism and so on, is also religion. Religious identities are moving through. So how does that manifest, and why is an architectural historian interested in it, is that it manifests itself in these very large projects, nationalist projects such as mosques, throughout the Islamic world, throughout, you know, and you start to see certain patterns evolve, you know, that they will be Neo-Safavid, you know, of the Persianate mode, they will be Neo-Ottoman, you know. There are very specific historicist design choices that are being made. And I was wondering why. Why in the end of the 20th century are we thinking about history? Why is history being evoked? Because I think my colleagues Hasnuddin Khan and Renata Holod wrote in a very interesting book on the mosque, in the modern mosque, and they noted that after the 1980s, we don't really see modern mosques, like certainly on the state level. You know, there's not that experimentation. Everywhere you go, there's a dome and a minaret, you know, which is fine, but they are evoking very specific historical models, you know. As you had, I think in one of your questions, you were thinking about, you know, why Ottomanism in Pakistan, what does that mean? And so what I discovered was that there are these zones of influence that are being deployed by, at least in my case, I was looking at 4 vectors, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and a new player, I guess, which seemed less intuitive, was the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf states, actually, as actors within these new zones of religious influence. So thinking about Saudi Arabia building the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad, which is, interestingly enough, a design that had been a neo-Ottoman design that was supposed to be in Ankara by Vedat Dalokay, got rejected there because it was seen as too Ottoman in the 1950s, 60s, gets appropriated and brought to Islamabad. The dome gets abstracted and now it looks like a tent, So interesting things are happening, but it was a gift to the Pakistani people from the Saudi government, Similarly, the Turkish government has been sponsoring mosque building everywhere from Tokyo to the United States, all over the new, post-Soviet republics. There are all these neo-Ottoman buildings that are being built. And what I was trying to argue was that something is going on, right, in terms of when you build these monumental architectural structures in the cityscapes that are not necessarily indigenous, they are marking certain alliances, creating certain types of identities. Because the thing with architecture is it's huge, it's spatial, and you inhabit it. It's a very embodied experience. So what happens when you are sort of, participating in a space that is reminiscent of, say, Istanbul or of Isfahan? Who are you thinking about, or what are you imagining yourself to be? So I really wanted to try and interrogate that question and really think about, why is history so important at this moment? Why is it at stake?
And why is that?
Why is it at stake? I think this is actually, interestingly enough, not restricted to the Islamic world. I think history is at stake for all of us because of the anxieties of modernity, in a certain sense, the anxieties of where we're going. I think, movement, the speed of communications, perhaps even a loss of indigeneity, which is really what we are losing in many places, our languages, our ways of living, and so on, that within that anxiety, there's an opportunity to come in and define for people who they might be.
Right. I can't help thinking that it's this kind of abstract imperial history.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It is an imperial history.
I mean, they started imagining, it's really towards the last quarter of the 19th century, in which you have people like Hali, people like Sharar, Shibli Nomani, who are in all of these different genres, imagining a new history, imagining new historical imagination. Shibli Nomani with his Heroes of Islam, Heroes of Islam series. So I mean, there's somebody madrasa educated but feels the need to give an English title, and of course the whole thing is imperial. History is the very imagination of history is as imperial history. The two are nearly coincidental.
That's right, and that's a beautiful example, because certainly in the cases of these figures, it's also a push against colonial history, right? I mean, so that is part of what has the desire to recuperate some origin myth about oneself, is to stitch back an identity that's been ruptured by colonialism.
Yes.
How do you retell your own stories? And in some sense, I'm not sure we're telling the right story.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really on their own terms, in fact. Because it's precisely, they imagine an imperial history for themselves, so we must also imagine an imperial history for ourselves.
Right, exactly.
Yes. The next question I wanted to ask you is more general, in terms of the challenges that you face as an art historian who works on Muslim history. Are there specific conceptual challenges?
Right.
Which of course is related to the larger question of what is the place of aesthetics in Islam, which of course people think is today, I would say, it's probably quite modern, think that they are mutually exclusive.
Right. I think there are two things. For myself, You know, I've always been very fascinated with the role of religion in contemporary thought. I think it's part of growing up here, you know, in Karachi. You go out into Sindh, you go to Sevan, you go to Bhet. You know, we're surrounded by, or, you know, Shah Ghazi's Mazar, under whose shadow I live at the moment. That we are surrounded by these very beautiful historical sites and cultures. And I've been always interested in understanding, you know, what does that mean? You know, these spaces also, each of them are, you know, again, you know, Shah Ghazi's Mazar is built on a Kali temple, you know, Sevan is built on a Shiv temple. You know, these are sort of, again, our histories of complexity, I think is what I would call it, because I don't want to reduce it to religious difference. But I think our histories of coexistence, of complexity, of openness, because, you know, you go to any one of these shrines, anyone can come.
Yes.
You know, anyone can come.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is very important for me to understand, but also as an educator to communicate, you know, to my students. And it's a privilege, as you know, to teach. And so when we have this privilege, what is it that we want to communicate? And I think to me that's really important, to talk about an Islam and a Muslim worlds, I would say, because there's not just one. There are multiple.
Yes.
Even within oneself, there are multiple.
Absolutely.
That we understand them in their breadth, in their, you know, in the multidimensionality of what Islam is. And so I teach it through material culture and architecture. You know, that's my medium through which I want to communicate.
Right.
Though it's a challenge, but I really also think of it as a great privilege to do that. You know, of course, we're in a post 9/11 world, you know, in the world in which you say Islam and people think of all kinds of things. Even Muslims think of all kinds of things that are very reductive. And so I think it's incumbent on us to actually do a little bit more, you know, to talk about something a little bit more interesting, I think.
Right. Could you tell us what you're working on now? And
I'm actually back in the early modern. I'm back in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it's wonderful to be doing research again. And it's changed from what I thought of it earlier. So I'm thinking about mobilities again. That's something I work on, but starting from the point of Iran, which is my research focus. Thinking about Isfahan, but imagining a world in which, if you're thinking about Isfahan, you're also thinking about Hormuz, you're thinking about the Portuguese, you're thinking about the British, you're thinking about, you know, if you think about the year 1600, for example, and just imagine this region, thinking about the Indian Ocean, everyone was passing through, you know, from slaves to ceramics, to carpets, to people, you know, there were the movement of objects and people and so on is mercenaries, and so on. So I'm sort of looking at this moment in time and thinking through different media, thinking about the city, thinking of Isfahan, which is going to transform entirely at this moment because of a few different things. For example, the introduction of coffee. Suddenly you have a culture, and this happens in Istanbul too, where suddenly you have coffee, the world becomes nocturnal. The city is awake in the way it never was before. You have cafes opening.
Fascinating.
Yes, you have suddenly cafes opening. So Shah Abbas is my protagonist. He is the ruler at this moment, contemporary of Shah Jahan and Akbar, and also Selim, and, you know, like, these are very important figures of this moment. That at this moment, he comes to the city Isfahan, for example, and suddenly fireworks are going off. Barud is a term that is used a lot, which is gunpowder. Right, which is very important for us to think of, because in terms of the city, it means there are fireworks and illuminations. The city is illuminated. She is resplendent, you know, but that means people have access to it. So it opens the city up to citizenry. You know, think about the idea of the citizen really starts to come alive at this moment. We see it in the Shehra Soup, the poetry, which is about being in the city, you know, so poetic sort of expression changes, paintings change, the way in which what you're painting, the subject of beautiful youth, of lovers, and so on. We start seeing that at that moment. And literally the city itself, the promenades open up. The same thing is happening in Fatehpur Sikri, if you think of it that way, again, regionally. I always am trying to think regionally because I think it's very important that people are moving back and forth so much. So, that's one aspect of, say, just something like gunpowder or Barood. And of course, the other side of it is war. These were, as Marshall Hodgson called it, the gunpowder empires, right? Where the Portuguese are actually very important protagonists because they have the technology of cannons and weaponry. The British are going to take full advantage of it because they have armadas and they have muskets. So suddenly, arms and ammunition are also playing a very important role and is changing the geopolitics of the world. So I want to make sure that as a historian, we're not just working on the aesthetic aspect of it. It's a beautiful, Lahore, these cities, these beautiful works of art, but what is the cost on a human level? And so that's something that I really want to try and bring into this book that I'm writing just now, which is a series of vignettes, with certain artists as protagonists. Like I said, Hormuz is that little island in the middle of the Persian Gulf is a very important space for me because that's where this great war against the Portuguese, the British and the Iranians, the Safavids are going to happen. So Florence is another space that I'm very interested in, So thinking on these multinodal spaces, but trying to tell a story about early modernity, again, not just from the aesthetic aspect of it, but also from the historical, and also the subjective, because this is the other part that happens is that we have people writing biographies, including rulers. Jahangir Nama, for example, is such an important text in which he's writing everything from what he ate to who his artists are and what he did. It's a very interesting way of thinking about one's own subjective spaces.
Right.
Artists are doing that all the time, and it really comes into being at this moment. So that's something I'm very excited about. It's
So on the subjective side, so when gunpowder first comes on the scene, so Machiavelli says that it's not going to affect the rules of war. This is what Machiavelli thinks, is that gunpowder is not going to change the nature of war. But did these people who you're talking about have a sense that they were living in a different age? Because Machiavelli obviously didn't have a sense that he was somehow different, was entering a new temporal and global space or world space.
Which he was though, right?
Which he was. But he didn't have that sense. But the people who you're talking about, do they have that sense that they are now in a different world, living in a...
That's such a beautiful question. That's a really important question. In some sense, that's really at the core, Professor Naqvi, of what I'm trying to get at. Did they have that sense? I'm not sure I'll answer it, What I would say is that what I'm looking at is the way they're expressing themselves.
Right.
And I have a feeling it's sometimes, as artists, as poets, as even as writers that you and I are, one might not be 100% conscious of what it is that we're expressing or experiencing, but our works speak for us.
Right.
So when we see paintings in Safavid Iran of these Portuguese youth, it's in the mode that is historicist, but what does it mean when a young Portuguese man with a gun interferes into your own visual idiom? Something is happening. Something very profound is changing. Or when my one of these historians that I'm reading is writing about this war in Hormuz, and he talks about Baruth raining like diamonds, like almas, he calls it, as they are attacking the fort with gunpowder and cannon. Something is changing, He is imagining a world that seems familiar, but at a scale that is unimaginable.
Right.
And I think that's part of what is interesting about this moment. And I'm not obviously the first who's noticed this. Many colleagues and scholars have written about this for several years. is that it's the scale, it's the globe, global scale, which is hard for us even today for me to understand. You know, I get my mind around how expansive that is, but it's an experience we have.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rizvi.
you.
I also wanted to ask you, since you've been here for
Yeah.
a little while, and thank you for your interest in Habib University. I wanted to ask you, what's your experience been here of Habib and what we're trying to do here?
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, again, thank you so much for including me and introducing me to the university and I think, very important work that you're doing here, and the commitment both to the humanities, which is of course so important, I think, as a colleague, as somebody teaching as well at a university, at a research university. The humanities is something that we are all, I think I'd be curious to know what you think also, but you know, this crisis supposedly of the humanities and in the shadow of the sciences and so on, I think is a false construct. It's a false dichotomy, because you can't have one without the other in my mind.
Right.
But the commitment that Habib University has made to the humanities is important. The commitment that I see that you're making to the liberal arts is really important. You know, I teach at Yale University, which in 1828, the white paper on why the liberal arts matter was written at Yale in 1828, almost 100 years ago. And so I firsthand get to see, you know, what the value of this is, of this project. But liberal arts are important because, you know, it teaches our students critical thinking. It teaches them how to analyze, how to think expansively, you know, and it's a very important tool that it's incumbent in some sense on us to teach the future generations, you know. So I appreciate very much what you're trying to do here, and mashallah, you know, doing it with such grace. I think it's wonderful, it's extremely important, and especially given the challenges that face our youth, you know, in the future, from climate crisis to, you know, all kinds of difficulties that are, I think having these tools are very important, and especially in a city like Karachi, in a country like Pakistan. It's a huge, huge impact that I think the university will have.
Lovely. Thank you for that testimony. And thank you to our viewers. Stay tuned for other Habib Talks. And thank you very much again to Professor Rizvi for taking the time out.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.